My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and it is time to work on finishing the project that I started. I don't even want to think how many months ago at this point, because it's taken way longer than I expected to actually get through it. But we're going to finish this project of going through Peter Jackson's movies, or at least the Lord of the Rings movies, and looking at extreme nitpicks, things that he actually got right, and subtle changes that only the real fans of the book would notice. And this is going to be part one of at least two videos on the extreme nitpicks. So let's take a look at some things that Peter Jackson put in these movies that doesn't make a lot of sense. First off, we get a scene after the Rohirrim have returned to Edoras and they're celebrating. Aragorn comes up to Gandalf and basically asks him, "Do you have any news of Frodo?" And Gandalf says, "No word, nothing." And my thought about this is, would you expect to have word of Frodo, who is trying to be very careful and secret in his approach to Mordor so that nobody knows he's trying to get into Mordor, and who is a lot of miles away? It would be one thing if, he said something like, as he does in another part of the movie, "Frodo has passed beyond my sight." That would be one thing. But he says, "No word," as if he's expecting to get news of Frodo from somebody, which doesn't make any sense to me. Next, after the scene where Pippin looks into the palantir, we get Gandalf questioning Pippin, of course, and one of the things that he asks him is if he saw Minas Tirith. And again, the question I have is, how would Pippin know this? How would he know if he was seeing Minas Tirith? He's never been there. It's not like they have photo books or travel books that show him what Minas Tirith looks like. How would he know that he was looking at Minas Tirith, even if that is what he was looking at? Has he ever had it described to him? Has he ever had anything told him about Minas Tirith at all that he would be able to know, "Oh yeah, what I saw was totally Minas Tirith"? Not that we know of. So it's kind of weird that Gandalf would ask him that without any help or context. This next one is something that I have covered in prior videos, mainly in one talking about how I really dislike what they did to movie Theoden. But it's the scene where Gandalf is, after explaining, the fallout from Pippin looking into the palantir, he's basically saying they need to be prepared to ride to Minas Tirith because that's where the big battle is going to be. And Theoden drops this line of, "Tell me, why should we ride to the aid of those who did not come to ours?" And of course everybody looks at him like, "What is your problem, old man?" And of course the problem with this is twofold. One of them is, really, you're going to risk the fate of Middle-earth on you being petty. But the other problem with this is, Theoden is literally the guy who would not send riders to Gondor in the last movie, and now he's acting like Gondor is the one who abandoned him. It's like you didn't even ask for their help. Now, leave aside the fact that, yes, somehow, as I pointed out in my Two Towers one, somehow Faramir and his men are aware that there's war in Rohan with Isengard attacking them at Helm's Deep. How they could get such detailed information at that point in the story is beyond me. But apparently the characters in Peter Jackson's movies are just aware of things that they really shouldn't be aware of. So theoretically, Theoden is relying on this uncanny knowledge on the part of everybody in Middle-earth, but that doesn't solve the problem, it just pushes it a level back. So we still have to wonder, Theoden, how was Gondor supposed to know that you needed help in the first place? It's not like they have satellites Denethor does have a palantir, okay, but Theoden doesn't know that. How are any of these people supposed to know what is going on in other parts of the world? We're living in an age of medieval technology. Carrier pigeon is, the fastest method of sending a message probably, unless you have a palantir, which nobody knows that anybody has one at this point. So this idea that Theoden has any cause to be angry at Gondor for not sending help, it only makes sense if you assume a number of things that can't even make sense in the story. Next, we get a scene where Arwen returns to Elrond instead of going to the ships and sailing west because she has a vision of basically her own son in Aragorn's arms and realizes what she's missing out on, as if that wasn't obvious to begin with. But the real issue I have, for purposes of this, video, is when she goes back and she starts talking to Elrond about, trying to do whatever. She says it's time to reforge the sword, and in this conversation, they go back and forth on a couple of things. And in the middle of it, if you don't pay attention, you might miss it. But in the middle of it, there's a complete change of costume for both of them. They both end up wearing something completely different at the end of it than at the beginning. Was this conversation something that happened over the course of a couple days? I mean, that doesn't really make sense, but it also doesn't make sense that in the middle of the conversation, they both decided, hey, you know what? We're getting really heated here. Maybe we should go change and then come back and start this over again. Why does their outfit, both of them, completely change in the middle of this scene? There's no apparent reason for it. Here's another one that I'm sure I have covered probably more than once on this channel before, but Frodo trusts Gollum over Sam more than once. This happens in a couple different scenes, and of course it culminates in, the whole Limbus scene at the threshold of Mordor, basically. But it always made no sense to me, and the reason it makes no sense is the ring corrupts you. It makes you want to do bad things, and it might make you ultra possessive of the ring, but up to this point, that has nothing to do with Gollum versus Sam. Gollum hasn't even begun at some of the earlier stages of this to play on Frodo's fear of losing the ring in order to turn him against Sam, and yet he still trusts Gollum more than Sam in a couple different scenes, and there's no reason for that. He's been with Sam for who knows how long at this point. We don't exactly know in the movie how long he's been on this journey, and we don't know how long before it in the movie universe he's known and been friends with Sam, but certainly it's a long time. He treats Sam like he's his best friend, basically, and Gollum is somebody that, at the beginning of the Fellowship, he says it's a pity Bilbo didn't kill him when he had the chance. Now, granted, now that he's seen Gollum, he does have pity for Gollum, but that's no reason why he would suddenly start trusting him, and certainly no reason why he would start trusting him above Sam, whom he has known and been friends with for apparently years. So, yeah, they wanted to do this so that they could build it up to the scene where he tells Sam to go home, which is like one of the worst things in this movie, in my opinion. But at what cost of, reality bending was this done? You have to, it's not even that you have to assume a lot of things, it just doesn't make sense. Next we get a scene at Dunharrow where Theoden is looking out over the assembled army of Rohan in the valley, and he says 6,000 spears, less than half of what I had hoped for. Why is it less than half of what he'd hoped for? You'd think he would have at least a pretty decent idea of how many actual men he could muster in Rohan. Why is there a difference that's that significant at this point? I mean, like, who's missing and why are they missing? Is there any good explanation for that? Maybe you could argue, that some of the people couldn't come because they're just not in time, and that's not something that Theoden was expecting, or I don't know. I mean, it just seems really weird to me that he would say less than half of what I'd hoped for, given that he's basically called all of Rohan to muster here, and it's been a few days. What's the holdup? Why is there such a small number when he's expecting a larger number? There's really no explanation given. Next, we get another scene of Legolas being a complete know-it-all and treasure trove of lore about all of Middle-earth, even though there's no reason to think he ever really left Mirkwood before. And this is where he, Aragorn, and Gimli are going through the paths of the dead, and he starts just rattling off facts about, the paths of the dead and the men of Dunharrow and all this stuff, and he just knows everything. Legolas in this movie trilogy is just the guy who knows everything. And it's, again, they're playing on the idea that Legolas is an elf, he's old, he's been around a long time, But that's not necessarily a reason why he would just be aware of all the information there is out there. He's a prince of Mirkwood. There's probably not a lot of reason he would leave Mirkwood in most cases. And it's not like Mirkwood is a treasure trove of lore that's been gathered. That's Rivendell. Rivendell is a place where a lot of lore has been gathered. The archives of Minas Tirith are a place where a lot of lore has been gathered. Mirkwood, not so much. So why does Legolas know everything? It's just, I get it. He's an elf, but it doesn't actually make sense if you think about it. And actually, he starts doing this a little bit earlier than when they actually go to the road of the Paths of the Dead. And in between that first part and when they actually go, we get Elrond coming to Dunharrow, because now he actually has reforged the sword, and he's bringing it to Aragorn. And how on earth did he get there that fast? Have you looked at a map? How far Rivendell is from Dunharrow? That's a long trip. And I mean a really long trip. Unless we're supposed to assume that all of Arwen's stuff happens completely out of sync with the stuff that they intersperse it with in the movies, and therefore Elrond actually did this, like a month earlier. There's no possible way he could have gotten to Dunharrow in time to catch Aragorn before he left. Now, you could just assume that that is in fact what happened, and the chronology is all out of sync, but it doesn't really seem to line up very well if you pay attention just to the internal movie chronology. I mean, the only way you could make it work is to squeeze it into the period where the company is basically traveling along the Misty Mountains before they end up in Moria, because Gandalf says we need to hold this course for 40 days. And it's not really clear how long they've already been on that course. So potentially there's a lot of days in between where a lot of stuff could have happened, and maybe we're just being caught up on that later. But the impression given by the movie is that a lot of this stuff is happening simultaneously, because we get the scene with Elrond conversing with Galadriel telepathically in the Two Towers before Arwen comes back, and actually kind of just after Arwen has left, which means all of that had to have happened more or less synchronously with the Fellowship, at least being around Rauros and then splitting up and then ending up in Rohan, because Galadriel is talking about them needing assistance to fight Isengard, and they send the elves to Helm's Deep, which is an oddly specific place to send them if they don't already have some idea what's going on, which means they have to have knowledge of what's going on currently with their conversation, which means it's really only been a few days since Arwen left that she came back and Elrond makes it to Dunharrow. There's no actual way to make that work. You could try to fit it in other parts of the movie if it weren't for this weird telepathic conversation that Galadriel and Elrond have, but once you factor that in, the timeline gets a little bit too locked down for this to work. Alright, once Elrond brings the sword and presents it to Aragorn, the way this conversation flows, I never noticed it before, but now that I'm actually paying attention, it seems kind of odd, really, the way it goes, because Elrond basically is saying, you need more men, and Aragorn says there are none. Elrond says there are those who dwell in the mountain. Aragorn says murderers, thieves, you would call on them to fight. They believe in nothing, they answer to no one. And then Elrond says they will answer to the king of Gondor. So this whole conversation is about you need more men and you're going to get them with the dead men of Dunharrow. That's the context. He hands Aragorn the sword and tells him, put aside the ranger, become the man you were born to be. Aragorn sweeps out the sword and says, Sauron will not have forgotten the sword of Elendil. As if the sword is what's going to bother Sauron. This whole conversation was about you need a bigger army. Why is he suddenly thinking just about the sword? And also, why is Aragorn suddenly all keen on wielding this sword that at the beginning of the middle of the Fellowship of the Ring, he was like, I have never wanted the power to wield the sword. Now he's all happy about it, and being, Sauron's going to be so afraid now, this is cool. What changed? I mean, I've talked about this in my video about how they changed Aragorn's character arc in this story radically in the movies. And people have tried to argue that, well, Boromir dying and then basically telling him, you need to save Minas Tirith and all this stuff have kind of changed his outlook and whatever. But that doesn't change the fundamental thing of, I don't want power and I don't want the power to wield the sword, whatever. That doesn't change any of that. That might change his outlook on what he needs to do in the future, like to save Minas Tirith, and maybe he needs to step up and do whatever. But why he suddenly just thinks the sword is really cool and something that's really important, why didn't he think about this before? Like, if Sauron hasn't forgotten the sword of Elendil, and that's an important point in this war, wouldn't it have been nice to have reforged it way earlier so that you could have used it to said purpose? It just... But also, he's focusing on entirely the wrong thing. Luckily, Elrond brings it back around and says, the man who wields this sword could summon an army more deadly than any that walks this earth. So, it's... Elrond is focused on the right stuff, but Aragorn's comment is kind of out of place if you think about it. It doesn't really flow naturally, and it especially doesn't flow naturally given what we know about him from other parts of earlier movies where he has rejected this whole idea of wielding the sword or having this power ever at all. So it's like suddenly out of the blue, he's not only okay with it, but he's also talking about it in a context which it doesn't really belong in. It's actually kind of weird when you think about it. Now, when we get to the part where Legolas, Aragorn, and Gimli are actually going to the Paths of the Dead, Legolas reads the inscription on the door. How? This is a long dead civilization of people who probably didn't even speak Western, let alone Elvish, and they clearly were writing in something like hieroglyphics based on what we see in the movie. How does Legolas read this? Again, Legolas can't know everything just because he's an elf and he's been around for a few thousand years. I don't even think it's clear when Legolas was born. That may or may not be in the appendices. But even if he was, nearly 3,000 years old, or even a little more than 3,000 years old, that barely puts him to the time of the defeat of Sauron at the end of the Second Age, which is when this group of people basically went extinct. And there's no reason that he would have had any significant contact with them to learn their language, or let alone their hieroglyphic writing style. What in the world? How do elves, and in particular this elf, know everything? Just everything, just because. They're supposed to be old, wise, and whatever, but that's not an excuse for them to literally just know all the things. That doesn't work in this kind of setting. But there you go, that's Legolas. Once we get into the Paths of the Dead, of course, the threesome end up confronting the King of the Dead and his vast army of the dead. And Aragorn says, I, call you to fulfill your oath. And he says, none but the King of Gondor can command me. And then Aragorn basically shows him the sword. It's a little more complicated than that. It's a little more dramatic than that in the movie. But the point is, he shows him the sword and makes it clear that he is the heir of the king. Isildur, that is. And after this point, the King of the Dead doesn't go, oh, okay, I guess I don't really have a choice then. He just got through saying, none but the King of Gondor can command me. And yet now he's acting like, I still don't really want to go through with it. This is pointless. I just don't feel like it today. If he can command you, then he's kind of got you. And you really just need to... Now, of course, ultimately, they do what they're supposed to do in the movie. And so you could maybe make this wiggle room with saying that he's just kind of toying with Aragorn, which doesn't make any sense either. What does he have to gain by that? He just wants to be released so he can actually move on in peace and stop being a ghost in Middle-earth. But they just draw this out to... It just adds dramatic tension, but to no real other purpose. And it's kind of nonsensical the way it all goes down. Now we get the mirror image of Theoden's, why should we ride to the aid of those who did not come to ours? Because Denethor basically does exactly the same thing, and it's not quite as bad, because in this case, even though Denethor apparently resisted lighting the beacons, because Gandalf, when he walks in the first time and meets him, says, you still have people that you can call for aid, light the beacons, and Denethor basically doesn't even respond to that, but by implication rejects the idea, and so Gandalf has Pippin do it, apparently against orders, because then we can see Denethor looking at it from the window with this scowl on his face, like, I can't believe he did that. Denethor is, like Theoden, a very misinterpreted character in these movies. But at any rate, so he at least has the excuse of the beacons were lit, and so Rohan was actually alerted to the fact that Gondor needs aid, unlike Theoden. But it's still ridiculously stupid when Denethor comes along and says, Rohan has deserted us and Theoden has betrayed me. Dude, you're the one that didn't even want to call him for aid, and you're getting all... And he only, of course, he only even mentions any of this whenever he looks out at the Pelennor fields after Faramir has been brought to him almost dead and sees the vast hordes of Mordor and suddenly despairs, and then he thinks of Theoden, the guy that he didn't even want to call for help, and who up to this point has also not arrived, and Denethor apparently wasn't worried about that. And, the other problem, of course, is, it actually does take time for people to travel, so is it really realistic to expect him to be here right this minute? No. Again, not as egregious as Theoden's, because Theoden's is just even more levels of stupid, but Denethor's is not, again, it's just really denigrating not a hero character, obviously, but a character who is at least worthy of some, level of respect, and they just completely trash him in the movie. Once the Siege of Gondor begins in earnest, of course, we start getting catapults and trebuchets doing their things. The Gondorians have trebuchets mounted at points in the city, which seems kind of odd in the first place. But what's even weirder is the stuff that they're chucking at the attackers, because it basically looks like chunks out of the city. There's big, huge sections that look like they were built out of large brick and are arches and other architectural arrangements that you gotta wonder, where are they getting this stuff? How did they get it to the trebuchets in the first place? And why are there just huge chunks of city architecture just lying around? I mean, how did that even happen? Did a part of the city just fall down? They were like, well, we could put this part back up, but instead we'll use this for trebuchet ammo and rebuild it with completely new stone? I mean, I gotta know the backstory to this, because I can't imagine one that makes any sense. Alright, last one from Disc 1 of the extended edition, and I'll call it here and then do Disc 2 in my next video. But when the siege towers start approaching the walls, being pushed by giant trolls, of course, we get this scene where the archers on the wall are shooting just straight at the siege towers, which are obviously covered in what looks like metal, but it could be some other, whatever, but it's a hard surface, whatever it is. It's not cloth, not something that you can shoot through. And they just repeatedly shoot at the tower itself over and over again, as if they're expecting to do damage. And Gandalf, the one who hasn't, actually been involved in any siege warfare ever, as far as we know, is the one who has to come up and tell them, don't aim at the towers, aim at the trolls, kill the trolls. Well, duh! Why are the archers shooting at the towers and not the trolls in the first place? They can't be that stupid, can they? I mean, really? These people are trained for war, obviously. They're archers and they're wearing armor and they're in Minas Tirith, which is a city that has been at, some level of war with who knows who for centuries, millennia even, and they don't have the brains to shoot at something that's actually a damageable target. I just, whenever movies make people, this is a common trope in horror movies, obviously, that people are incredibly stupid and that's how they end up falling victim to whatever the thing is in the horror movie, right? But it's bad enough in a horror movie, and it's bad enough in anything that's supposed to be comedic. But this is a serious scene in a serious movie, and we're just supposed to assume that all these people are basically complete idiots. I mean, complete idiots. The definition of insanity, right? The one that we all hear from time to time, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. That's what they're doing. They're shooting at a target which is not taking any damage more than once. We see it happen more than once, and they're expecting something different to happen the second time. It's just nonsense, and it drives me crazy when movies have to resort to things like that. And I'm not even sure what the point of it was in this scene. Like, what are we supposed to gain from them being idiots? Are we supposed to just learn that Gandalf knows that you should shoot at the... Are we supposed to get that out of it? What is the point? Why is this here? Why is this scene there? I don't understand the value that we're supposed to get out of it to even measure against the immeasurable stupidity of what's going on. So it's just bad, with no redeeming qualities at all. So anyway, that is, my extreme nitpicks of Peter Jackson's Return of the King first half. I'll finish it up in a second video next time. And that's pretty much it for this video. If you did enjoy it, please do, give it a thumbs up, share it around. Subscribe if you want to catch more of my content. If you're on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions every week. And check out the other social and support links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.